This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More about them later in this video. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today's script was penned by the ever-capable Ben Edelman. Be sure to deploy your likes on this video, show some love to Ben in the comments, and strap in for a wild ride. Oh, and while you're at it, I've got a question for you. What is, in your opinion, the most important manufacturing effort undertaken during World War II, and why did it contribute to the eventual victory of the Allies? With that out of the way, let's get to it. During the Second World War, African Americans faced a battle on two fronts, the one overseas against the forces of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and the one at home against racism, segregation, and discrimination. Nowhere was the inherent hypocrisy of the country's stance, fighting for freedom abroad while denying it to millions at home, more apparent than in the armed forces, where black men were forced to serve in segregated units and to work menial, dangerous jobs such as cooking, cleaning, and in the case of sailors assigned to the Port Chicago Naval Magazine, loading ammunition into cargo ships. The inherently unsafe conditions at Port Chicago, which were exacerbated by racial prejudice, was a recipe for disaster. Over 300 men were killed in an accidental explosion in 1944, over 60% of whom were African American. Rather than address any of the systemic issues that had caused the disaster, the Navy instead ordered the surviving sailors to carry on as they had before, as though they were pretending the accident had never happened. But the sailors at Port Chicago refused to pretend any longer. Hundreds of them refused to work, saying that they would not load ammunition until conditions had changed. What the civilian workforce would recognize as a strike, the Navy called mutiny, and brought these sailors up on charges, sending 50 of them to prison in a highly publicized trial that caught the attention of high-profile figures like Thurgood Marshall and Eleanor Roosevelt. The Port Chicago disaster and the mutiny that followed are an important, if rather obscure, part of American history. It set off a chain of events that eventually led to the complete integration of the US Navy and eventually the entire armed forces. Over a decade before the Montgomery bus boycott kicked off the civil rights era, these men paid a heavy price for making a stand for equal treatment, for a chance to serve their country without being treated as inferior. By mid-1944, the US was helping turn the tide of World War II in favor of the Allies. The key reason for America being able to successfully combat both Germany in Europe and Japan in the Pacific was her massive industrial capacity, which was churning out prodigious quantities of military equipment and supplies, as well as millions of men and women in uniform. In order to get all of this from the United States to the battlefield, the US military built up a complex logistics system that stretched across the country from factories to seaports, like the Port Chicago Naval Magazine. The base, which was located near the small town of Port Chicago at the mouth of the Sacramento River, 35 miles northeast of San Francisco, California, was designed for a single purpose, as a place where military ammunition was brought in by train and loaded onto cargo ships for transport overseas. Planning for it had begun before Pearl Harbor, when top Navy brass judged the existing facilities on the naval base at Mare Island to be inadequate for the needs of a major war in the Pacific Ocean. Operations at Port Chicago began in December 1942, and by 1944 the base was the most important ammunition loading facility on the West Coast, serving as the embarkation point for most of the ammunition earmarked for the Pacific theater of the war. How it worked was simple. Train cars loaded with all manner of deadly implements, including magazines of bullets for M1 rifles, hand grenades, artillery shells, aerial bombs, depth charges, and torpedoes, were driven out to the end of a long wooden pier, alongside which one or two cargo ships, mostly newly built Liberty ships, would be moored. It was then the job of the ammunition loaders to transfer the contents of the boxcars into the cargo holds of the ships, which was mostly done by hand, partially assisted by steam or electric-powered winches. The 1,400 enlisted men assigned to Port Chicago as ammunition loaders were divided up into 10 divisions, or work gangs, of roughly 100 to 125 men each. Each division was assigned to work a particular shift and a particular ship. Loading operations at the base continued around the clock, on a schedule of 3 days on, 1 day off. One thing that was impossible to miss was that every man loading ammunition at Port Chicago was black. and nearly everyone else on the base, including the officers who commanded them, was white. If you want to be able to spread your brand's message, then you're going to need a fancy website to get your message out. And today's sponsor, Squarespace, is just what you're looking for. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform. Regardless if you're an entrepreneur, an activist, or an artist, Squarespace has all the tools you need to get the job done, all in one place and on your terms. With Squarespace's next-generation website engine, the Fluid Engine, you'll be able to choose from a template and customize it to your heart's content. And unlike using an expensive web designer, your website will be fully functional on desktop and mobile from the get-go. With Squarespace's guided design system, Squarespace Blueprint, and their brand spanking new AI and SEO tools, you'll be able to pick from a curated list of layout and styling options to ensure you're able to build your brand the way you want from the ground up, and make sure your website hits all those SEO sweet spots, ensuring you reach the right people to grow your audience the way you want. And best of all, if you're looking to sell your widgets on your website, Squarespace offers flexible payment options with simple but powerful tools. Accept credit cards, PayPal, and Apple Pay, and in eligible countries, your customers will have the option to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now, back to the video. The US Navy, like the rest of the armed forces, was segregated on racial lines during the war. At the beginning of the war, African American sailors were restricted to serving in any capacity except as cooks and mess stewards. However, in 1942, facing acute manpower shortages and pressure from civil rights leaders, the Navy began training black sailors for general service. However, they were still subject to strict segregation from whites and were routinely assigned to do menial jobs such as laborers instead of combat duty. The work at Port Chicago was not only menial, it was dangerous. Handling explosives of any kind is an inherently risky business, but the way the Navy was doing it here was particularly so. The sailors handling the ammunition had received no special training in how to do so safely, and were instead expected to learn on the job. Their officers, who were all white despite having over 100,000 black enlisted men in its ranks prior to January 1944, the Navy did not have a single black commissioned officer, were no better off. In fact, the Navy had no training program for handling munitions. It apparently had never occurred to anyone that loading explosive cargo into a ship needed to be done differently than boxes of soap and chocolate. As a result, the loading procedure at Port Chicago was full of unsafe practices, including allowing bombs to roll against the side of the ship, dropping munitions, and in general allowing the bombs and shells to be jostled in a way that made a Coast Guard safety detail cringe. Their commander withdrew them from Port Chicago, proclaiming that he would not be responsible for what the Navy was doing there. The unsafe work also alarmed civilian stevedores working across the bay at Mare Island. They offered to send men to the base to teach the sailors how to do the job properly, but the Navy never took them up on it. Above all, there was an emphasis on speed at Port Chicago. The base commander put much more emphasis on getting the ammunition loaded quickly than doing it safely. He posted the hourly tonnage rates of each division on a chalkboard, rewarding the quickest workers while threatening to punish the slower ones. Because that always works. This encouraged a spirit of competition among the work gangs. The officers would place bets with each other on who could load more ammunition in a shift, so their sailors were literally racing each other to do their jobs quicker. Many of the ammunition loaders realized that this was an accident waiting to happen, an understatement, trust me. But their concerns were dismissed by the officers. They assured them that since most of the bombs they were handling weren't live, that is, their fuses hadn't been installed yet, that they couldn't go off accidentally. Well, we'll see about that. 10 p.m. on July 17th, 1944. As usual, the pier of Port Chicago was buzzing with activity. There were two ships tied up at the pier, the SS E.A. Bryan, which had about 4,600 tons of munitions in her hold after about 4 days of loading, approximately 40% of her capacity, and the SS Quinault Victory, which was empty, having just arrived at the base a few hours ago. She was being prepped to begin loading munitions at midnight. At 10:18 p.m., there was an explosion at the pier. 5 seconds later, a second, far more powerful explosion went off. sending an orange fireball high into the night sky that could be seen for miles. A passing military plane reported seeing chunks of metal debris being flung more than 12,000 feet into the air, and the size of the fireball as having a diameter up to 3 miles wide. The blast wave rippled out for miles in every direction, wrecking most of the buildings on the base and many civilian structures in Port Chicago. Many people, civilian and military, were seriously injured when they went to their windows to look out at the first explosion, only to be caught in a shower of broken glass when the second one went off. A massive rescue effort was launched, both to put out the fires that had started before they could set off any more explosions and to pull injured people from the wrecked buildings. However, nothing could be done for those unlucky souls who had been working on the pier when it detonated. All 320 men there had been killed instantly. The E.A. Bryan had literally been blown to smithereens, with only small pieces of wreckage having been recovered. While the Quinault Victory had been torn into pieces, the stern was flung into the water 500 feet away and sank. A Coast Guard fireboat that was docked at the pier, as well as the pier itself and all the rolling stock on it, were completely destroyed. An official Navy inquiry was unable to determine what caused the initial explosion. Anyone that was close enough to see what happened did not live to tell their story. Possible explanations include the failure of a winch that had been malfunctioning earlier that day, sending its explosive cargo crashing to the ground, and possible mishandling of 650-pound incendiary bombs, which were hot cargo, meaning that they had their fuses installed in them during the loading process. What is known is that the second explosion, which was a sympathetic detonation as a result of the initial one, was massive. All of the approximately 5,000 tons of munitions in and around the E.A. Bryan exploded virtually simultaneously. Seismographs at UC Berkeley recorded the second blast as having the equivalent force of a 3.4 magnitude earthquake, while estimates put the total explosive yield at around 2 megatons of TNT, making it the third most powerful accidental explosion in recorded history. 202 out of 320 men killed in the explosion were African American. So were many of the 390 injured, making this one incident responsible for 15% of African American casualties suffered during the entire war. Only 51 of the dead were able to be identified. Only parts of many bodies could be located, while those closest to the blast were never found at all. Their bodies had literally been disintegrated. It was the worst homefront disaster of the conflict for the United States. However, there was a war on, and the country was used to appalling headlines, so the explosion at Port Chicago quickly disappeared off the front page. The Navy, too, wanted to get back to business as usual. No one was held responsible for the disaster, no changes to procedure or plans to improve safety were made. Work quickly began to rebuild the facilities at the base, while loading operations were temporarily transferred to other facilities like Mare Island. One group of men who refused to move on from the blast were the surviving sailors assigned to load ammunition. Any illusions they had that what they were doing was safe had been shattered, and now they were being asked to go back to doing it again, using the same flawed procedures under the same untrained officers as before. For many of them, it was the last straw. Most of them had enlisted in the Navy or been drafted to go to sea. They had been trained to serve their country aboard a ship, including combat duty. Instead, simply because they were black, they were relegated to second-class status, denied opportunities for promotion or advancement, forced to serve under officers who ignored their complaints and routinely insulted them by writing that they were intellectually inferior to their white counterparts in official reports. They weren't even welcome to patronize the businesses of Port Chicago when they were on liberty. This despite the fact that California had no Jim Crow laws and was considered to be a more enlightened state than those in the South. The men were also understandably angered by the insults offered to them after the disaster. Congress made plans to award $5,000 to the families of the victims of the explosion, only to have the bill blocked by Representative John Rankin of Mississippi, who insisted that the amount be lowered to $2,000 once he found out that most of the recipients would be black. Wow. The ammunition loaders were also denied the customary 30-day survivor's leave, usually offered by the Navy to survivors of a major incident, like a ship sinking or an explosion. They were also the only ones who didn't receive this benefit. Their white counterparts, both officers and enlisted, did. Despite what officers would later claim, the Port Chicago men were not of one mind about what to do next. There was a drastic mix of emotions. Some were afraid of another explosion, some were angry that the Navy appeared not to care whether they got blown up or not. Many were still recovering from injuries sustained in the explosion or were still in a state of shock about what had happened. Had they been evaluated today, more than a few of them would have been diagnosed with PTSD. At some point, an unofficial consensus emerged that the sailors would not load any more ammunition, at least not until conditions were changed. Some men claimed they would not load under any circumstances. So on August 9th, when the men were ordered to load ammunition into the USS Sangay at Mare Island, they would not, much to the chagrin of their officers. Had they been workers in the civilian world, it would have been called a strike or work stoppage, a common form of labor protest for decades at that point. But the military doesn't have strikes. You either obey orders or face serious trouble, so the Navy called it something else: mutiny. Mutiny is the most serious charge that can be levied against a sailor. It is usually used to refer to the crew of a ship who rise up in open rebellion against their captain or superior officers, such as the famous mutiny on the HMS Bounty in 1789. Now, normally, the simple refusal to obey a specific order wouldn't be considered an act of mutiny, but during a time of war, the Navy felt they needed to make an example of the Port Chicago men to discourage other sailors from doing the same, and to avoid having to admit they'd done anything wrong to cause it to happen in the first place. The traditional penalty for mutiny is death, and the Port Chicago sailors were certainly threatened with just that if they did not go back to work. Over 200 of the strikers were persuaded. They would be slapped with the lesser charge of disobeying orders and subject to the forfeiture of 3 months' pay. A total of 50 men who still refused to go back to work were charged with mutiny. Seaman First Class Joseph R. Small, who was widely respected by his peers despite holding no official leadership position, was considered the ringleader of the mutiny and held in solitary confinement. At 23, Seaman Stahl was one of the oldest sailors on trial. Most of them were teenagers. The mutiny trial was held on Yerba Buena Island, which, along with neighboring Treasure Island, made up a Navy base right in the middle of San Francisco Bay. Quite unusually, the Navy took pains to publicize the trial, allowing heavy access by the press, further reinforcing that they planned to make an example out of the so-called Port Chicago 50. Anyone following the trial closely, such as NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall, could tell that the outcome had been predetermined. Nearly every motion went in favor of the prosecution, while the defense was mostly continually hamstrung by decisions rendered against them. After a month-long trial, the court-martial panel of 7 naval officers deliberated for only 80 minutes before finding all 50 men guilty of mutiny. Just over a minute and a half of consideration per sailor. All 50 men were sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, though the jail term was shortened for the majority of men as an act of clemency. Marshall, the special counsel for the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, was unimpressed. He made immediate plans to appeal the verdict on the sailors' behalf while writing damning pieces in the organization's magazine, The Crisis. His charges that the verdicts had been racially motivated started a nationwide protest, with pamphlets circulating alongside petitions signed by thousands to set aside the convictions. The movement even caught the attention of the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, who sent a note to the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, asking him to take special care on the case. The Navy found itself on the defensive. They refused to overturn the mutiny convictions, claiming that there had been no racial bias involved. Bullshit. While at the same time taking steps to avoid the appearance of discrimination against black sailors. Detachments of white sailors were assigned to load ammunition at Port Chicago, while black sailors were given wider roles and responsibilities in the service, including one destroyer, USS Mason, that was crewed entirely, except for the captain, by African American officers and men. Despite this, more and more racially motivated incidents of disorder and violence, including one riot that saw white and black Marines shooting at each other at a base on the island of Guam, continued to crop up. Navy leadership came to the extremely obvious conclusion that their policy of racial segregation wasn't working and began to take steps to integrate the service, culminating in a decision in February 1946 to completely end segregation of sailors based on race. Because as it turns out, it's very hard for people to hate people that they know personally. Of course, this did not end acts of racism, both overt and subtle, against black sailors. There was a racially motivated riot on board the USS Kitty Hawk off the coast of Vietnam in 1972, for instance. But it was still progress. Of course, by 1946, World War II was over, Germany and Japan both having surrendered to the Allies. There was no longer any need for harsh punishments to encourage servicemen to do their duty, so the Truman administration made the decision to quietly release almost 2,000 men locked up in military prisons, including the Port Chicago 50. Their criminal records, however, would follow them for the rest of their lives. The convictions of all 256 sailors involved in the Port Chicago Mutiny would remain on the books until July 17, 2024, last month, the 80th anniversary of the explosion. In a surprise ceremony, Secretary of the Navy Carlos del Toro signed an order that vacated all the convictions of the Port Chicago men, including the 50 convicted of mutiny. The order came too late for the men themselves, since they have all passed away, but the restoration of their good names allows their relatives to receive benefits that were denied to them by the convictions, including back pay. Thurgood Marshall, meanwhile, would go on to become one of the most respected attorneys in U.S. history, arguing more than 30 cases before the Supreme Court, including the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision that ruled segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. In 1967, President Johnson appointed him the court's first African-American justice, a position he held until 1991. One of the attendees of the ceremony exonerating the Port Chicago men was his son, Thurgood Marshall Jr. After the war, the rebuilt Port Chicago Naval Magazine was absorbed into the larger Concord Naval Weapons Station, a huge facility which became the main armament shipping facility for the military during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The town of Port Chicago itself eventually disappeared into the base, the Navy razing the buildings to the ground after acquiring the town through eminent domain in 1968. During the 1980s, the base became the center of the protest movement against the Reagan administration policy of providing arms to counter-revolutionary groups in Nicaragua and El Salvador, culminating in an ugly incident in 1987 when a protester was run over by an armaments train, resulting in the amputation of both his legs. Today, the Port Chicago site is still located on an active military base, but the site of the 1944 explosion was set aside on the 50th anniversary as a national memorial, maintained by the National Park Service to commemorate the victims of the disaster. The site is open to the public, but requires a reservation in advance since you have to traverse military property to get to it. The park site also honors and remembers the 50 men who took a brave stand for equal treatment and were severely punished for it. Sailors whose sacrifice opened the door to the eventual complete integration of the armed forces in 1948. Despite the pivotal role that they played in the civil rights history of the country, the story of Port Chicago is largely unknown to most Americans, which does a real disservice not only to those who died, but also to those who suffered while serving their country as a result of flawed Navy policy and outright bigotry. In order to properly honor their sacrifices, we must always remember events like Port Chicago, if for no other reason than to make sure it never happens again. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this content, be sure to deploy those likes, drop some more comments, and share this video with someone who loves learning about places and their complex histories. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.